Leadville, Colorado, September 1879. While 46 mining families raced to complete their cabin windows before first snow, Thomas Brennan was building frames 4 inches deep, twice the standard frontier thickness. His neighbors called it wasteful construction. They called him a fool. Settlement foreman Jacob Miller watched Brennan mill custom lumber for window frames that would hold not one pane of glass, but two, separated by precisely 1 inch of empty air. The frames alone consumed 3 additional weeks of construction time and $18 in extra lumber. Miller shook his head, calculating the cost. That's 3 months of mining wages burned on redundant glass, he told anyone within earshot. Brennan had ordered 96 panes from the Denver glass merchant, double the 48 panes that Miller and every other sensible settler considered adequate for a 16 by 20-foot cabin. The mathematics were stark. Standard window installation cost $63 and required 5 days of work. Brennan's approach would consume $127 and demand nearly 4 weeks of meticulous construction. In a settlement where men earned $40 monthly in the mines and firewood sold for $4 per cord at 10,000 feet elevation, such extravagance seemed like madness. Hans Bergstrom, the settlement's master carpenter who had immigrated from Sweden 14 years earlier, brought professional authority to the growing criticism. Bergstrom's credentials were unquestionable. He had built over 60 cabins throughout Colorado's high country mining camps, each one following proven Scandinavian principles, adapted to frontier conditions and extreme altitude. His standard design called for single-pane windows set in 2-inch deep frames, a specification he had refined through 8 years of construction at elevations where winter temperatures routinely dropped to 20 below zero. "I've built windows that survive at 9,000 feet and above," Bergstrom declared to the assembled men at the settlement's evening gatherings. "One pane is plenty." Brennan is either ignorant of altitude conditions or has more money than sense. The technical specifications of Brennan's project became community conversation throughout September. Each window measured 24 inches wide by 36 inches tall, requiring 2 panes of 1/8 inch glass, fitted into frames with inner and outer rabbets precisely 1 inch apart. The 4-inch frame depth demanded specialized joinery that consumed hours of careful work. Brennan sealed the edges between panes using heated pine pitch and wool batting, creating what he called a dead airspace that would prevent heat loss. The concept seemed reasonable in theory, but the practical reality of spending an additional $64 for a second layer of glass struck most settlers as impractical experimentation they could not afford at altitude where heating costs already strained household budgets. Catherine Wells, whose boarding house successfully heated 12 rooms through previous Leadville winters using conventional single-pane windows, watched Brennan's progress with financial pragmatism born of running the settlement's only commercial lodging operation. Wells had invested substantial capital in her establishment and understood construction economics better than most frontier residents. Every dollar spent on unnecessary building materials was a dollar unavailable for fuel, food, or the countless expenses that determined business survival in a remote mining camp. She had calculated her winter heating costs precisely through 3 years of operation, maintaining comfortable guest quarters while spending approximately $90 on firewood between October and April. Her windows featured standard construction that Bergstrom had installed, proven designs that balanced cost with adequate performance. Settlement leader Jacob Miller, a Pennsylvania native whose decade of mining camp experience had taught him the critical importance of efficient resource allocation, questioned Brennan about his unconventional methods during a chance meeting at the settlement's general store. Miller had founded this particular Leadville section in 1877 by applying hard-learned lessons from failed mining camps where poor planning and wasteful construction had driven families away. Complete adequate shelter quickly, conserve precious cash for necessities, follow proven building methods. Brennan's approach violated every principle of practical frontier construction at altitude. Come January, Miller predicted to his wife Elizabeth that evening, Brennan will wish he had that extra money for firewood instead of useless air gaps. The criticism carried weight in a community where winter fuel costs could consume 20% of a family's annual income, and where miscalculating heating requirements meant genuine suffering through months of sub-zero temperatures. As October approached and the first frost warnings appeared in morning valleys at lower elevations, the contrast between Brennan's unfinished window installations and his neighbors' completed cabins became increasingly apparent. Miller had already begun stacking firewood and testing his heating system during cold nights. Bergstrom was checking window seals and preparing for winter's assault. Wells had completed all weatherization tasks and was accepting advance bookings from miners, seeking reliable heated lodging through the coming months. Brennan, meanwhile, continued his meticulous work with quiet determination that puzzled his neighbors. When questioned about his methods, he offered only brief explanations that revealed knowledge sources unfamiliar to most frontier builders. Glass conducts heat straight through to the cold outside, he told Bergstrom during one of their conversations. Air trapped between panes stops that transfer. It's like wearing two shirts with space between instead of one thick shirt. The analogy seemed logical, but few settlers understood why the principle would justify doubling glass expenses and sacrificing weeks of construction time that could be spent on other essential preparations. His $127 investment in windows represented more than most families spent on their entire cabin's materials, a figure that seemed to confirm suspicions about wasteful priorities that would prove costly when Leadville's legendary winter cold descended on the settlement at altitude, where thin air provided no buffer against Arctic systems sweeping down from Canada. October 28th brought the first hard freeze to Leadville, dropping temperatures to 12 degrees Fahrenheit and testing every heating system in the settlement. The cold arrived suddenly after sunset, catching families in the middle of evening routines and forcing immediate responses from heating systems designed for gradual temperature declines. By dawn on October 29th, the differences between cabin performances became measurable through simple observation and the thermometers that several families kept mounted inside their dwellings. Brennan's cabin registered 58 degrees Fahrenheit at 6 in the morning, 8 hours after his fire had died completely at 10 the previous evening. His family had slept comfortably through the night without adding fuel or maintaining coals. Jacob Miller's cabin told a different story. Despite banking coals carefully at midnight and maintaining a small fire until 4 in the morning, his interior temperature reached only 41 degrees by dawn. Miller had burned through nearly a quarter quart of firewood in 14 hours, following the continuous fire management approach that frontier wisdom dictated for cold weather survival. His family had slept in the warmest corner near the fireplace, layered under wool blankets that barely compensated for the inadequate heat retention his cabin achieved, despite constant fuel consumption. Hans Bergstrom's situation proved even more challenging. His cabin registered 38 degrees at sunrise, despite his professional construction methods and continuous overnight fire banking. The Swedish carpenter who had confidently declared single-pane windows adequate for altitude conditions found himself burning firewood at rates he had not anticipated, maintaining flames through the night to prevent interior temperatures from dropping into dangerous ranges. The visual evidence appeared most dramatically on window surfaces throughout the settlement. Single-pane glass accumulated ice on interior surfaces, building layers 1/4 inch thick by morning that obscured views and blocked significant percentages of daylight. Families scraped frost from inside their windows each dawn, a daily chore that revealed the fundamental heat loss occurring through conventional glass installations. Brennan's windows presented a striking contrast. The inner panes remained completely clear, showing no frost formation whatsoever. Only the outer panes displayed ice accumulation, proving that interior heat was being retained rather than conducted straight through to frozen exterior air. Catherine Wells, walking past Brennan's cabin on her morning rounds, stopped to examine the phenomenon. "It's like his windows know which side is inside," she remarked to her husband Charles. genuinely puzzled by the selective frost patterns that defied her understanding of how glass should behave in extreme cold. By mid November, firewood consumption patterns provided mathematical evidence that vindicated Brennan's expensive investment. His family burned fires from 4 to 6 in the afternoon only, a 2-hour heating schedule that consumed 6/10 of a cord through the month. The settlement average reached 1 8/10 cords, representing 3 times Brennan's fuel requirements for inferior comfort results. Miller began tracking the numbers with the careful attention he applied to mining yields and operational costs. The man who had mocked Brennan's glass expenses now calculated that his own family was burning through firewood at rates that would consume $54 by spring, compared to Brennan's projected $18 fuel cost for the entire winter season. Hans Bergstrom's curiosity evolved beyond professional skepticism into genuine technical interest. The carpenter visited Brennan's cabin during an early November cold snap, carrying his measuring tools and notebook. Bergstrom examined the window frame construction with the systematic attention he had learned during his apprenticeship in Stockholm, measuring the precise 1-inch gap between glass panes and studying the pine pitch seal that prevented air infiltration. He asked detailed questions about thermal principles that Brennan answered with knowledge that clearly extended beyond simple frontier building experience. Dead air is the key, Brennan explained, holding his hand near the window surface to demonstrate temperature differences. Glass conducts heat at nearly 1 watt per meter, Kelvin. Air conducts at only 24 thousandths of that rate when you trap it, so convection currents cannot form. The terminology came from Pittsburgh glasshouse technical training, knowledge that Brennan had absorbed during 5 years working in industrial furnace operations before moving west to the mining frontier. Catherine Wells took a more pragmatic approach to evaluating Brennan's innovation. She maintained detailed expense records for her boarding house operations, tracking every dollar spent on fuel, food, and supplies with the precision that separated successful frontier businesses from failed ventures. Her November firewood costs reached $22 for heating 12 guest rooms, a figure that projected to $132 for the 6-month heating season. Wells began calculating what double-pane windows might save her establishment, considering the substantial initial investment against long-term fuel reductions that could improve her profit margins significantly. The boarding house owner, who had dismissed Brennan's methods as impractical extravagance, now saw potential economic advantages that her business sense could not ignore. Jacob Miller maintained his skeptical position despite mounting evidence, though his certainty had begun showing cracks. "It's been a mild November," he insisted to anyone willing to listen, noting that temperatures had only dropped below zero twice during the month. "Real cold hasn't hit yet. Wait until January brings those 30 below stretches that last for weeks. Then we'll see if his fancy glass makes any difference at all." The prediction carried weight among settlers who remembered previous Leadville winters when sustained extreme cold had tested every heating system to its breaking point and beyond. Yet Miller's own woodpile was shrinking noticeably faster than Brennan's, visual proof that even November's moderate conditions were revealing fundamental performance differences between heating approaches. December would tell the true story, Miller declared with diminishing confidence, as weather reports mentioned an unusual Arctic system building strength across Canada and preparing to sweep south through the mountain territories where thin air at 10,000 feet elevation provided no insulation against the coming assault. December brought sustained cold to Leadville, with average high temperatures reaching only 18 degrees Fahrenheit and nighttime lows dropping to 8 below zero. The month-long freeze tested every cabin in the settlement, separating theoretical heating adequacy from practical performance under continuous extreme conditions. Thomas Brennan invited curious neighbors to his cabin on December 15th for a demonstration that would reveal the physics underlying his window design. Hans Bergstrom arrived carrying a surveyor's thermometer borrowed from the mining company's equipment shed, ready to take precise measurements that would either validate or disprove Brennan's claims about trapped air and heat retention. Brennan set up two identical oil lamps 6 inches from window surfaces, one facing his double-pane installation and another positioned against a single-pane window section he had deliberately left unconverted for comparison purposes. The lamps burned at the same intensity, producing equal heat that radiated toward the glass barriers, separating warm interior air from frozen exterior conditions. After 30 minutes of steady burning, Bergstrom took his measurements. The single-pane window's outer surface registered 62 degrees Fahrenheit, proving that heat was escaping rapidly through the glass and warming the exterior air uselessly. Brennan's double-pane window told a dramatically different story. The outer pane measured 34 degrees, barely above freezing, while the inner pane maintained 58 degrees, demonstrating that heat was being retained inside rather than conducted straight through to the cold mountain air outside. The scientific principles became clear through Brennan's explanation, delivered in language accessible to men whose education came from practical experience rather than formal schooling. Glass moves heat through itself very easily, he told the assembled neighbors, like a metal pot handle that gets hot when you leave it over fire. Air trapped between two barriers cannot move, so it holds heat on the warm side instead of letting it escape to the cold side. Think of it like two blankets with space between them, keeping you warmer than one thick blanket pressed against your body. The analogy resonated with men who understood bedding and insulation from daily frontier life, translating abstract thermal conductivity concepts into concrete comparisons they could grasp immediately. Brennan revealed the knowledge sources behind his innovation, explaining his 5 years working in Pittsburgh glass houses, where industrial furnace efficiency determined profitability. German immigrant workers had shared European traditions of double window installations, common in Bavaria and Prussia, regions where severe continental winters demanded superior heating solutions. Brennan had spent 3 years experimenting in a Pennsylvania warehouse, testing various air gap widths and sealing methods until he identified the optimal 1-inch spacing that prevented both convection currents and excessive heat loss. He had also studied Pullman railroad car designs, where double-pane windows allowed transcontinental passengers to travel comfortably through winter landscapes without excessive heating costs that would make long-distance rail service financially impractical. The December results provided mathematical validation that skepticism could not dismiss. Brennan's firewood consumption reached 1 2/10 cords for the month, maintaining average dawn temperatures of 54 degrees Fahrenheit, with fires extinguished 10 hours before morning. His family experienced zero window ice buildup and no condensation issues, as the air gap controlled moisture migration that plagued single-pane installations. The community average told a starkly different story. Families burned through 3 1/10 cords during December, more than double Brennan's consumption, while achieving only 39 degrees average at dawn, despite maintaining overnight fires that required constant attention and fuel management. Window ice reached half-inch thickness in most cabins, a daily problem that reduced light transmission and required morning scraping that wasted time and energy better spent on other essential tasks. Hans Bergstrom announced his conversion publicly at the settlement's December 23rd gathering. He had ordered double-glass panes for a workshop addition he was constructing, acknowledging that his professional expertise had been incomplete regarding thermal dynamics at extreme altitude. The Swedish carpenter who had built 60 cabins using single-pane standards now admitted that Brennan understood principles he had never considered during 2 decades of frontier construction work. Catherine Wells began detailed calculations for her boarding house, determining that retrofitting her 38 windows would cost $214, but save $96 in fuel costs during the first winter alone. The investment seemed substantial, but her business mind recognized that the payback period of 2 1/4 years made economic sense for an establishment she planned to operate indefinitely. Jacob Miller resisted the mounting evidence with arguments that grew increasingly defensive. One warm December doesn't prove anything, he insisted, though temperature records showed the month had been colder than the previous 3 December periods. His own woodpile had diminished to 40% of its October volume, while Brennan's stack remained 70% intact, visual proof that Miller could not explain away through stubborn adherence to conventional wisdom. Two new settler families planning spring cabin construction approached Brennan for specifications, requesting detailed measurements and construction guidance that would allow them to incorporate double glazing from the foundation stage rather than attempting costly retrofits later. The technical details Brennan shared became community knowledge through informal evening discussions. Frame construction required double rabbet joints, cut precisely to hold 2 panes, with exact spacing maintained by wooden strips. Ceiling demanded pine pitch heated to specific temperatures for proper application, combined with wool batting that prevented air infiltration without compressing the critical gap. Glass spacing proved crucial, as gaps narrower than 3/4 inch allowed convection currents that reduced insulation value, while gaps exceeding 1.5 inches permitted excessive heat loss through radiation. Brennan had tested spacings from 1/2 inch to 2 inches during his Pennsylvania experiments, identifying the optimal range through systematic measurement and comparison. By month's end, the community stood divided between pragmatists, convinced by measurable results, and traditionalists, clinging to methods that demonstrably failed under sustained cold. Weather almanacs predicted a January of unusual severity, forecasting Arctic systems that would test heating approaches beyond anything most settlers had experienced. Miller declared that the coming month would be the final judge of whether Brennan's expensive glass investment represented genuine innovation or fortunate performance during moderate conditions. The statement carried less conviction than his earlier pronouncements, undermined by December's clear evidence that double-pane windows delivered superior results regardless of whether skeptics acknowledged the mathematical reality confronting their failing heating systems and dwindling fuel supplies. January 12, 1880, brought an Arctic blizzard that plummeted Leadville temperatures to 31 degrees below zero, the coldest reading in settlement memory. The mercury remained locked in extreme cold for 16 consecutive days, creating survival conditions that separated adequate heating from catastrophic system failure. Wind screaming down from the Continental Divide created conditions miners estimated at 50 below zero, accounting for wind effect, though formal measurements of that phenomenon would not exist for decades. Snow drifts blocked the wagon road connecting Leadville to lower elevation timber sources, cutting off firewood deliveries precisely when desperate families needed fuel most urgently. Logging crews could not work in cold that froze exposed skin in minutes, halting all fresh timber cutting and forcing the settlement to survive on whatever reserves families had accumulated before the crisis began. Jacob Miller burned through 2.5 cords in 16 days, 5 times his normal consumption rate, in a desperate attempt to keep his family alive. His single-pane windows allowed heat to escape as fast as his fireplace could generate warmth, creating a losing battle against cold that penetrated every gap in his cabin's construction. Ice buildup on interior window surfaces reached 2 inches thick, blocking 30% of available daylight and turning his home into a dim cave, where his family huddled near the fire in multiple layers of clothing. Miller made the agonizing decision to abandon 3/4 of his cabin, moving his wife Elizabeth and 2 children into a single room where concentrated heating might maintain survivable temperatures. Even there, dawn readings showed 28 degrees, despite fires that burned continuously through every night. The children slept wearing coats and wrapped in every blanket the family owned, waking with frost on the wool covering their faces. Miller spent $22 on emergency firewood, purchased from a speculator who charged $12 per cord, triple the normal rate. The expense represented 2 weeks of mining wages, money the family could not afford, but had no choice except to spend or freeze. Hans Bergstrom faced a stark comparison that proved Brennan's concept beyond any remaining doubt. His workshop addition, completed in late December, with double-pane windows, following Brennan's specifications, maintained 48 degrees with minimal heating. His main cabin, with conventional single-pane construction, became uninhabitable, forcing his entire family to relocate into the small workshop space where superior windows made survival possible. Bergstrom's wife Anna prepared meals and managed household activities in cramped quarters, while 3/4 of their cabin sat abandoned to cold that froze water solid within minutes. The Swedish carpenter, who had built 60 cabins using proven methods, now slept in his workshop, living proof that his professional expertise had been incomplete. "I should have listened in October," he admitted publicly at the settlement store, his voice carrying the weight of a man whose pride had nearly cost his family their safety. Catherine Wells's boarding house faced financial catastrophe during the freeze. 12 guests generated massive heating demands that consumed her entire winter fuel reserve in just 12 days, forcing emergency purchases at crisis prices that devastated her carefully managed budget. She began charging guests an additional $2 per night as a heating fee, a surcharge that 3 miners refused to pay. They departed for warmer accommodations at lower elevations, costing Wells $72 in lost revenue over the 16-day crisis. She seriously considered closing the establishment until spring, acknowledging privately to her husband that her single-pane windows made winter operations financially unsustainable during extreme cold. The boarding house owner, who had heated 12 rooms successfully through 3 previous winters, now confronted the reality that conventional construction could not handle sustained Arctic conditions at 10,000 feet elevation. Thomas Brennan's cabin stood as a remarkable contradiction to the settlement's suffering. Interior temperatures maintained 51 to 56 degrees throughout the 16-day freeze, with his normal fire schedule requiring only 25% additional firewood above December consumption. The family continued their established routine of heating from 4 to 8 in the afternoon, then sleeping comfortably through nights when their neighbors fought desperate battles against cold that threatened their lives. Brennan's total fuel consumption during the crisis reached 1 1/10 cords, less than half what Miller burned, while achieving interior warmth that allowed normal daily activities to proceed without interruption. His children completed schoolwork at the table, while Miller's children huddled immobile near the fire. His wife Catherine cooked regular meals, while other families subsisted on whatever food could be prepared with minimal movement from heat sources. The visual evidence became undeniable by January 20th. Steam rose consistently from Brennan's cabin windows throughout morning hours, visible proof of interior warmth meeting cold glass surfaces. Neighboring structures showed no such signs, their frozen interiors generating no temperature differential sufficient to create condensation or steam. Brennan's windows displayed their characteristic pattern of clear inner panes and frosted outer surfaces, demonstrating that the air gap continued performing exactly as designed under the most extreme conditions imaginable. His chimney produced smoke only 4 hours daily, while neighbors' chimneys belched continuous emissions from fires that barely kept families alive despite consuming wood at unsustainable rates. January 23rd brought the crisis to its breaking point. 3 families could no longer heat their cabins adequately and moved temporarily into neighbors' homes, creating overcrowded conditions that strained everyone's diminishing resources. Children and elderly settlers showed signs of frostbite and cold-related respiratory illness that threatened to become life-threatening if the freeze continued much longer. Jacob Miller, his authority as settlement foreman, challenged by circumstances beyond his control, called an emergency meeting at Catherine Wells's boarding house, the only space large enough for community gatherings, despite its own heating struggles. Miller's voice carried none of its earlier certainty when he addressed the assembled families. "We need to understand what Brennan knows," he said quietly. "Pride won't keep our families alive." Hans Bergstrom stood and shared his workshop experience, describing the dramatic temperature difference between his double-pane addition and single-pane main cabin. "I've proven it in my own building," he told the crowd. "The double glass works, and it works better than anything I've built in 20 years." Thomas Brennan offered to host a demonstration on January 25th, opening his cabin to the entire settlement for measurement, observation, and questioning. He would share every specification, every technique, every principle underlying his window design. "No secrets," he promised. "This knowledge belongs to everyone trying to survive up here at altitude, where conventional methods clearly fail under extreme conditions." 34 settlers attended the gathering in Brennan's cabin 2 days later, entering a space where comfortable shirt-sleeve warmth greeted them after walking through cold that threatened exposed flesh. They watched Brennan's children playing normally on the floor, observed his wife working at household tasks without layered clothing, and felt heat radiating gently from windows that looked no different from their own, except for that 1-inch gap of trapped air that made the difference between comfort and suffering, between adequate survival and potential death in the unforgiving cold of Colorado's high country winter. February brought brief warming periods that allowed desperate families to begin retrofitting their cabins with the double-pane windows that might prevent another crisis, like the January freeze. 8 households started immediate modification projects despite the substantial costs and labor requirements, recognizing that survival at altitude demanded superior heating solutions, regardless of initial expense. Samuel McKenna gathered flat stones during thaws, but more urgently, he ordered 48 additional glass panes from the Denver merchant, planning to convert his 16 windows from single to double-pane construction before another Arctic system could trap his family in a frozen cabin. His wife Martha had documented their winter firewood consumption with careful arithmetic, recording 4.5 cords burned compared to Brennan's 2 8/10 cords. The numbers provided mathematical proof that McKenna's Virginia mountain heating methods, adequate at lower elevations, failed catastrophically at 10,000 feet, where thin air offered no buffer against extreme cold. Jacob Miller's conversion came with public acknowledgement of his error. The settlement foreman who had mocked Brennan's wasteful glass investment now ordered materials for his own retrofit, hiring Hans Bergstrom to modify his window frames for double-pane installation. The work would cost $68 and require 4 to 6 days of careful carpentry, but Miller understood that another winter of single-pane performance would consume far more in emergency firewood purchases and risk his family's health through months of inadequate heating. His January fuel costs alone had exceeded his entire planned winter budget, forcing him to take extra mining shifts to cover the deficit created by windows that hemorrhaged heat faster than his fireplace could generate warmth. Thomas Brennan began conducting construction workshops in late February, teaching neighbors the precise techniques required for successful double-pane installation. Frame building demanded double rabbet joints, cut to hold 2 glass layers with exact spacing maintained throughout, a carpentry challenge that required skills beyond basic frontier construction. Bergstrom attended every session, applying his European guild training to master methods he had never encountered during 2 decades of building in Colorado's mining camps. The frames needed reinforcement to support glass weight that measured 2 3/10 times heavier than single-pane installations, requiring corner bracing and foundation calculations that accounted for the additional structural load. Brennan demonstrated sealing methods using pine pitch heated to 180 degrees Fahrenheit for optimal workability, combined with wool batting applied in specific sequences that prevented air infiltration while maintaining the critical gap that provided insulation value. Glass handling instruction proved equally important as frame construction techniques. Brennan taught neighbors to transport panes in wooden crates that prevented breakage during hauling from the freight depot, explaining installation sequences that avoided stress cracks caused by improper fitting. The space between panes required thorough cleaning before final sealing, as any dust or debris trapped in the gap would remain permanently visible and potentially compromise thermal performance. Breakage repair access demanded planning during initial construction, with removable trim pieces that allowed glass replacement without destroying the entire frame assembly. These details, learned through Brennan's 5 years of experimentation, eliminated the trial and error that could make double-pane construction expensive and frustrating for inexperienced builders. The winter's final accounting provided compelling economic justification for double glazing adoption throughout the settlement. Brennan's total firewood consumption from September through March measured 4 2/10 cords, costing $16.80 at standard $4 pricing. His family had maintained average interior temperatures of 54 degrees throughout the coldest winter in local memory, burning fires only 4 to 6 hours daily and experiencing zero window maintenance issues. Community averages painted a starkly different picture. Families using conventional single-pane windows consumed 11 8/10 cords over the same period, spending $52.60, including crisis period premium pricing that desperate circumstances had forced them to pay. Their average interior temperatures reached only 41 degrees, despite burning fires 16 to 20 hours daily and performing daily ice removal from window surfaces that reduced light transmission and wasted time better spent on productive activities. The economic impact extended beyond simple fuel cost comparisons. Brennan's $127 glass investment, so widely mocked in September, had saved $35.80 in the first winter alone, establishing a payback period of 3.5 years. Projected over a cabin's typical 15-year lifespan, the double-pane windows would save $537 in fuel costs, a sum representing more than a full year's mining wages for most settlement families. Time savings proved equally significant. Families using Brennan's heating approach saved approximately 420 hours per winter in fire maintenance activities, time that could be redirected toward mining work, household production, or family activities that improved quality of life, rather than merely sustaining survival. Jacob Miller stood before the March community meeting and delivered words that settlement members would remember for years afterward. "I was wrong," he said simply. "Brennan understood what we didn't." The foreman who had predicted that Brennan would regret his wasteful construction now became the strongest advocate for requiring double glazing in all new settlement building projects. Miller implemented specifications into informal community standards that governed construction practices, establishing Brennan's 1-inch air gap and 4-inch frame depth as minimum requirements for any cabin built under settlement jurisdiction. Hans Bergstrom's professional transformation from skeptic to specialist happened rapidly during March and April. The Swedish carpenter began traveling to 6 neighboring mining camps at Aspen, Crested Butte, and smaller settlements throughout the high country, teaching thermal window construction techniques to builders who faced identical heating challenges at extreme elevations. Bergstrom developed standardized frame designs for various cabin sizes, creating templates that reduced construction time while ensuring consistent quality. He negotiated volume discounts with the Denver glass merchant, making double-pane installation more affordable for families operating on tight frontier budgets. Catherine Wells committed $214 to retrofitting her boarding house's 38 windows, a substantial investment that her business calculations justified through projected first winter fuel savings of $96. The work proceeded through March, transforming her establishment into the most efficiently heated commercial building in Leadville. Wells immediately noticed improved guest satisfaction as room temperatures became more comfortable and consistent. She eliminated the unpopular heating surcharge that had driven customers away during the January crisis, instead advertising her superior accommodations as a competitive advantage that justified premium rates. The boarding house that had nearly closed during the freeze became the preferred lodging for mining executives and merchants who could afford quality accommodations and appreciated comfortable heated rooms that required no supplemental stoves or excessive blankets. By April, 4 new cabins under construction incorporated double pane specifications from foundation planning through completion, integrating thermal requirements into site selection and structural design rather than attempting costly modifications after initial building. The local quarry reported 300% increased demand for flat stones used in foundation work, supporting heavier window installations, requiring expanded operations to serve construction projects throughout western Colorado's mining region. The knowledge that one man's willingness to challenge accepted frontier practices had generated spread beyond Leadville through correspondence, travelers, and the informal networks connecting remote settlements, where families shared information critical to survival in harsh environments. 5 years earlier, Jacob Miller had stood in his frozen cabin, watching ice accumulate on window surfaces, while his children huddled near a fire that consumed firewood faster than he could afford to replace it. Today, in March 1885, Miller looked through double-pane windows that remained clear in the coldest weather, living in comfort that seemed impossible during that desperate January when survival itself had hung in the balance. His retrofitted cabin maintained temperatures 20 degrees warmer than the original construction had achieved, while his fuel costs had dropped 62% from those catastrophic first winter figures that had forced him to work extra mining shifts just to pay for emergency firewood purchases at crisis prices. The transformation that began with one man's willingness to invest in what neighbors called wasteful construction had spread throughout Colorado's high country by 1885. 23 mining settlements above 9,000 feet elevation had adopted double glazing as standard construction practice, documenting 147 cabins either retrofitted or built new with the thermal window techniques that Thomas Brennan had brought from his Pittsburgh glasshouse experience. 4 commercial buildings, including boarding houses and assay offices, featured the upgraded windows, while 2 schoolhouses reported dramatically improved winter attendance after installing double-pane glass that made interior spaces comfortable enough for children to concentrate on lessons, rather than merely enduring cold that had previously made winter education nearly impossible at extreme altitude. The economic impact reached beyond individual household savings to transform entire community resource management. Aggregate fuel savings in Leadville alone totaled $4,557 annually, money that families redirected toward productive investments rather than burning through chimneys in desperate attempts to maintain survivable temperatures. Timber pressure on high-altitude forests decreased 35%, as reduced firewood demand allowed marginal logging areas to recover from overcutting that had threatened long-term wood availability. Housing values shifted measurably, with cabins featuring double-pane windows commanding prices 15% higher than comparable structures using conventional single-pane construction, reflecting buyer recognition that superior heating represented genuine economic value worth paying premium prices to obtain. Technical evolution continued as builders refined Brennan's original specifications through systematic experimentation. The optimal air gap for altitude conditions proved to be 7/8 inch rather than the full inch Brennan had used, a minor adjustment that improved performance slightly while reducing frame depth requirements. Several ambitious builders attempted triple pane installations only to document diminishing returns that made the added expense and construction complexity economically unjustifiable for residential applications. Seasonal window designs emerged, featuring removable outer panes that could be stored during summer months when double glazing provided no benefit, and single pane operation reduced interior heat buildup in cabins that became uncomfortably warm during July and August, at altitude where thin air provided little cooling capacity. The Colorado School of Mines began studying Brennan's technique in 1882, bringing scientific instrumentation to measure thermal efficiency improvements that frontier builders had recognized through practical experience but lacked equipment to quantify precisely. Researchers confirmed 55% heat retention, improvement compared to single-pane windows, publishing findings that established double glazing as proven technology, rather than folk innovation of uncertain reliability. The measurements provided thermal resistance values that would later be formalized as R-value calculations, though that specific terminology would not enter common usage for decades after Brennan's original Leadville installation demonstrated principles that scientists would eventually codify into building standards. Federal recognition came through the United States Geological Survey's 1883 report on high-altitude settlement patterns, which specifically credited Leadville innovation in its recommendations for Wyoming and Montana territorial development. Government surveyors acknowledged that double glazing enabled year-round occupation of mining camps that had previously functioned only as seasonal operations, transforming economic development patterns throughout the Mountain West. Camps that might have remained temporary became permanent towns, as families could survive winters that conventional construction made too harsh for women and children, shifting demographics from predominantly single-male miners to stable communities with schools, churches, and commercial establishments that required year-round population bases to remain economically viable. Individual transformation stories illustrated the human impact behind statistical improvements. The Miller family, which had nearly abandoned their Leadville homestead due to unsustainable heating costs, thrived through the early 1880s with 2 children born after conditions became comfortable enough that Elizabeth felt confident raising infants through high-altitude winters. Jacob Miller's public acknowledgement at the March 1885 community gathering carried the weight of a man whose family's future had been saved by knowledge he had initially rejected. Brennan's windows saved more than money, Miller told the assembled settlers. They saved our future here at altitude, where conventional methods would have driven us back to lower elevations and ended our mining prospects. Catherine Wells's boarding house became the most profitable lodging operation in Leadville by 1885, commanding premium rates justified by comfortable heated rooms that mining executives and merchants preferred over cheaper accommodations that offered adequate but not superior winter conditions. Wells advertised her double-pane windows prominently, recognizing that the feature provided competitive advantage worth emphasizing to customers who appreciated quality and were willing to pay for demonstrable comfort during business travel that might last weeks or months in harsh winter conditions. Hans Bergstrom quit general carpentry entirely to specialize in thermal window construction, training 4 apprentices in techniques that generated steady income. Servicing 8 settlements within 50 miles of Leadville, his annual earnings increased 170% compared to conventional carpentry work, proving that specialized expertise in innovative construction methods could be more valuable than traditional building skills in frontier communities desperate for solutions to environmental challenges that standard approaches failed to address adequately. Thomas Brennan never sought patents or attempted to profit from the knowledge he freely shared with anyone trying to survive at altitude. This belongs to everyone up here, he maintained consistently, helping more than 60 families implement double glazing through personal consultations that cost neighbors nothing beyond their own materials and labor. His family enjoyed financial stability through firewood savings that compounded to $179 over 5 years, while his cabin's enhanced value and his reputation as a knowledgeable builder brought modest consulting income that supplemented mining wages. Most significantly, the Brennan family thrived in conditions that had defeated others, proving that understanding basic physics principles could be more valuable than following accepted practices when those practices were fundamentally inadequate for extreme environmental conditions. The March 1885 anniversary gathering celebrated more than Brennan's innovation. Settlement members recognized that their willingness to abandon failed methods and adopt superior techniques had transformed Leadville from a marginal mining camp into a viable permanent community where families could prosper rather than merely survive winters that had once threatened to drive everyone back to lower elevations and end the economic opportunities that had drawn them to Colorado's high country in the first place. Jacob Miller presented Brennan with a hand-carved window frame plaque inscribed with words the community had chosen carefully. "The man who taught us that air could be as valuable as glass," the inscription read, acknowledging the counterintuitive principle that empty space, properly deployed, could provide insulation superior to any solid material frontier builders had previously considered adequate for window construction at extreme altitude, where conventional wisdom had proven catastrophically insufficient. The original 1879 windows continued performing flawlessly in 1885, showing no seal failures, no glass breakage, and no deterioration in thermal efficiency after 6 full winters of service at 10,000 feet elevation. The simple innovation continued saving fuel, maintaining comfort, and proving daily that true frontier wisdom sometimes required challenging every assumption about what practical construction really meant. Brennan's wasteful investment of $64 in 3 weeks had returned benefits measured not just in hundreds of dollars saved, but in families who stayed rather than leaving, in children who thrived rather than suffering, and in a community that learned the most important lesson frontier survival could teach. The cheapest construction is not the most economical. The most efficient construction is, even when efficiency requires initial investments that seem extravagant to those who measure only immediate costs without calculating long-term returns, that distinguish genuine wisdom from false economy in environments where nature tests every decision against standards far more demanding than human judgment or traditional practice.